Hi, my name is Matthew Perniciaro, and I'm the co-director and executive producer of Moment of Truth.
They were as close as any father and son could hope to be.
I'm lucky to be a part of what he is, what he stands for, and what he's doing right now.
This is the father of the most famous athlete on the planet, Michael Jordan. And on his 57th birthday, he was an unidentified dead man in the swamp in the middle of nowhere.
The body has been positively identified as Mr. James Jordan.
In North Carolina, you probably couldn't find a more famous family than the Jordans.
There was immense pressure to solve this case.
Police have charged 18-year-old Daniel Green and 18-year-old Larry Demery with first-degree murder.
They were paraded into the courthouse for the cameras. I mean, it looked like you were broadcasting the Super Bowl out there in the parking lot.
Anything you want to say to the Jordan family?
I didn't kill him.
Authorities say Jordan died of a single gunshot wound to the chest, but no blood was found in the car.
It couldn't have happened as described.
They did not find a bullet hole in the chest area of the shirt. And how is it suddenly there when this case comes to trial?
I'm trying to stop short of corruption, but maybe I shouldn't.
This case was complicated from the very beginning. There had been a history of racial injustice and law enforcement corruption in Robeson County.
It is not uncommon in Robeson County for innocent people to be charged just to close a case.
The jury didn't hear all the facts. There were people involved who did not want information revealed.
It's always the deputy that wins.
They start pitting them against each other.
I'm starting to believe he's telling the truth. You shot and killed Mr. Jordan.
He's wearing the dead man's jewelry. It doesn't look good.
Both of us kind of like pawns in a game.
There is still so many lingering mysteries to this case.
The hardest part is watching the people that you love suffer because they know that you're innocent. In this country, we have an expectation that freedom is a right, and it's not. Freedom is a privilege. I'm fighting for my freedom.
It's finally time that someone tells the truth.
That is a trailer from the soon-to-be-released docu-series Moment of Truth, and this is Factual America. We're brought to you by Alamo Pictures, a London-based production company making documentaries about America for international audiences. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and today we're talking about James Jordan Sr., Michael Jordan's father, who was tragically murdered in 1993 under mysterious circumstances. And talking to us about this, and arguably North Carolina's most notorious county, is Matthew Perniciaro, the award-winning director and producer of Moment of Truth. So, Matthew, welcome to Factual America.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's great to have you on. How are things with you?
Things are good. You know, we are very excited to have this series be releasing on April 2nd. So it's only a short while away, and excited for people to see what we've been up to for the past few years.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, as you say, and as our listeners and viewers have heard or seen, Moment of Truth, it's, as you said, releasing on April 2nd on IMDb TV, Amazon's premium free streaming service. And so congratulations on this finally being released. And is this your feature-length or series directorial debut?
It is. I've produced many documentaries throughout my career. I've been producing for about almost 20 years. And I've directed a lot of short-form documentary projects that we've done in the past, but this is my first long-form series or feature debut. So I'm very excited about it.
Well, that is exciting, and thanks again. Congratulations again, and thanks for coming on. So this is one of those, Moment of Truth. You don't necessarily know exactly what it's about just from the title. So maybe you can tell our listeners what this series is about.
Sure. Moment of Truth is about the murder of James Jordan and the investigation and trial afterwards that resulted in the conviction of two teenage boys, Larry Demery and Daniel Green. And we tried to take a complete 360-degree view of the case, presenting all of the facts in a way that I don't believe have ever been presented before, using footage that has not been seen in decades or never before publicly, to create kind of almost like a trial itself, the two arguments that have existed around this case as to what transpired. This is a case that's been shrouded in a lot of mystery for decades, and conspiracy theory. And while those are interesting on one level, our true interest in this story was to get to the truth of what actually happened and how this occurred, because there's a lot of evidence that took place at trial and has come out since that raises questions about what we were all told 28 years ago.
I think you've already now told us why this is, why it's doc worthy. I mean, it definitely was a heinous crime. It's anyone who, I mean, I was living in the States then. You did describe these mysterious circumstances, and I'm always wary of we don't have any spoiler alerts here. I mean, but Daniel Green in particular, one of the teenage boys you mentioned, has professed his innocence of the murder. Is that that's fair enough to say, I think. And
Daniel's proclaimed his innocence since the day he was arrested. Larry, who's the other teenager who was charged with the case, charged with the crime, he took a plea deal and admitted his guilt as part of that plea deal. But Daniel's maintained his innocence for, nearly 28 years.
Okay. Well, let's start with, the victim here. Maybe tell us a little something about James Jordan Sr., because a lot of people will have seen The Last Dance recently, and certainly for those of us who remember Michael Jordan's career, his dad played quite prominently, certainly there in the early days.
Yeah, James was an unbelievable supporter of his children and their ambitions. And, we had found this one amazing piece of archival footage, and we could talk a little bit about how we work with archival in this series later on, but that talks about, James and Dolores Jordan were fixtures at every North Carolina basketball game. And in the state of North Carolina, the Jordan family was immensely celebrated. Obviously, Michael is, probably one of the most, if not the most famous people to ever come from the state of North Carolina. But James was a beloved father and a beloved individual in the community. And it was a great loss, I think, not just for his family, but for the community. And it was very shocking that this crime could take place in North Carolina.
Some more will come out on both sides here of this conversation. I lived in North Carolina for the better part of 6 years, so in the 80s and early 90s. So I am aware of a lot of people in North Carolina who almost saw Michael Jordan as godlike, really. As even a potential answer to problems. People, every person who had a very legitimate, reasonable, charitable thing they were working on would be, hey, what if we write to Michael Jordan? That was part of it. So he is beloved, even those who didn't necessarily go to the same university he went to. But I think what I found interesting, there's many things that are interesting. What it reminded me of were, and you're not making any allegations here, but there's these mysterious circumstances about his murder. You don't expect every day the greatest of all time basketball player, his dad to be murdered. But he's missing for weeks and it's never reported. And I think he even misses his birthday, doesn't he? And it's this kind of, that adds to the mystery, doesn't it?
I think a lot of things added to the mystery. I think because of the high profile nature of the Jordan family, there was an immediate sensitivity to this. But I think also James, he traveled a lot. He went around a lot. And then you have to remember, this is email in 1983, emails in its early stages, cell phones are in their early stages. It was not commonplace for us to be connected day in, day out like we are now. And it was not uncommon for him to go on a golfing trip with his friends and not be in touch with anyone for a week or two. It was so it didn't raise any immediate concerns. But when he started not showing up for some previously planned events, the family started, I believe it was Michael's security detail, started looking into potentially what was going on. A public investigation was not opened at that time, but Michael's, team started looking into it. When the car was found, when his car was found abandoned that is when the public, the law enforcement search took place in full.
Yeah. And that even when he was first found, his body found, unfortunately, he was a John Doe, wasn't he? I mean, they didn't even realize that was Michael Jordan's father.
They didn't. I think there was a lot of confusion in those early days of the case because it was very complicated. His body was found in South Carolina. Robeson County, which is where the crime took place, is right on the border of North Carolina, the southern border of North Carolina and South Carolina. So James's body was found in South Carolina, and the car was found not in Robeson County where the crime took place, in a different county. So ultimately, it's interesting that they put the pieces together on it, within a matter of weeks. I think, when you look at the degree of complication around the case, you had two state-level law enforcement agencies, and you had multiple county law enforcement agencies, all kind of sharing and pooling information and trying to put together all the different aspects of what could have transpired here. And that ultimately led to the interrogation and the arrest of Daniel and Larry.
Indeed. We'll probably be getting more into this later as well, but I mean, they very quickly zero in on them. And the thing is, if you do a quick search on this on the internet or whatever, it pretty much everything gets presented as it's pretty black and white. These teenagers did it. Story's done, isn't it? I mean, it's there doesn't seem to be on the surface immediately. Do you see get any wind of controversy, really?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. The public story was the story that the national media adopted very quickly. And it was that this was a robbery or a carjacking that went wrong. And, that these, the statements were made that these two boys saw, James Jordan was driving back from Wilmington, which is where the Jordan family is from, and to their home in Charlotte, which is about a 3.5 hour drive or so, and had gotten tired. It was late at night and pulled over off the side of the highway. And these two young men, tried to attempt to rob him, and it went wrong, and they shot him, and in cold blood. And that was the public story. I think one of the things you have to look at is, even at the time, there were a lot of questions about that story. And what those questions ultimately resulted in has been decades of conspiracy theories. And, when things don't add up in a criminal case, despite the public narrative that you're being told, a lot of times it does lead to these kind of conspiracy theory nature, things emerging, and ultimately there were things that didn't add up. But it's just not the things that everyone thought they were. Everyone thought, oh, this must be tied to some larger narrative, and series like The Last Dance have talked about this already. And, that was not kind of diving into the conspiracy nature of this was not our intention here. Our intention was to discover the truth of what transpired and how that was obscured. But, it did give birth to all these theories and rumors, and that's because a lot of things, even at the time, didn't add up and make sense. It's just not what people thought it was.
Okay.
Those things weren't adding up because of something different.
Well, and I want to talk some more about that if we may, but one last thing about the Jordans on this one is that I thought was interesting. I don't know, I'm a bit slow, but I hadn't really put two and two together looking back on that time. But you kind of, even one of the final episodes, you talk about how this affected Michael Jordan. And I never had even really necessarily tied it directly to his retirement and picking up baseball and that era of his career.
Yeah, I think the Jordan family, this is the greatest loss of their lives.
Yeah.
It's if that happens to anyone, and I think because that changes you in a way. Mm-hmm. And I think for us, in approaching this story, we always kept that in mind, and we wanted to approach this with a great sensitivity. This is the patriarch of their family, and he was taken away from them in cold blood, in a matter of moments. And you have to kind of look at the humanity of those situations and treat them with great respect. And, I do believe, Michael's retirement shortly thereafter James's murder, whether it was conscious or subconscious, we'll never know.
Yeah.
But James's favorite sport was baseball. He wanted to be a baseball player himself, and he loved when his kids played baseball. So I think, one of the journalists that we interviewed made that connection, and I think that there's, something to look at there.
Yeah. As you said, I think you mentioned James Jordan almost went pro as a baseball player. And I think the series says at the end, I have watched the whole thing. You have reached out to the Jordans, and they've always been, very private about this in a very, I would say, dignified way, to be honest, about the whole affair. So unsurprisingly, they didn't say, yes, we'll go on camera or anything.
Of course. Yeah. We felt, my partner in the series is Capital Broadcasting Company, which owns WRAL, which is one of the largest news networks in North Carolina and the largest in the Triangle area, which obviously covers Chapel Hill and the University of North Carolina. Right. So they've been covering Michael as a athlete since the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
And there's a long-standing, respect between everyone involved, and out of that respect, we wanted to offer the opportunity to say, we understand that this is difficult, and we understand that why you most likely will not want to, but if you wanted to participate and comment, we would love to talk to you about it. Michael and the family have only talked about this a handful of times over the past 3 decades, so they through a spokesperson respectfully declined to participate in an interview, and we've respected those wishes. And like I said, they're treating this with a degree of respect. It's such a heinous crime. It's such a sad situation for everyone involved, and such a great degree of loss. That was the only way you could honor this story, was treating it with respect.
Okay. And it's not the only tragedy, I think, as we find out as we watch this series. So actually, I'm going to say this. Why don't we take an early break? And we'll be right back with Matthew Perniciaro, director and producer of Moment of Truth. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with director and producer Matthew Perniciaro. His docu-series is Moment of Truth, releasing on April 2nd. IMDb TV, the premium free streaming service from Amazon. Matthew, this is going to sound a little cliche because we're talking about a documentary, but one of the main subjects is also Robeson County, isn't it?
That's very true. In telling this story, I don't believe you could tell this story correctly without telling the story of Robeson County, which is the county where the crime took place. It is a long fractured history of violence, racial injustice, and corruption in law enforcement, which, like a lot of times in the documentary space, and when a lot of filmmakers are looking at telling stories in the true crime space and documentaries specifically, a lot of assumptions are made. With this case, due to the nature of it taking place so long ago, a lot of the assumptions that one might have made 25, 30 years ago have come to pass. And, many of the sheriff's department was embroiled in a scandal where a lot of this corruption that had long plagued the department was brought to light by the district attorney's office. And many sheriffs and deputies were charged in that, which was called Operation Tarnished Badge. So knowing that, we weren't having to make leaps on a lot of the assumptions we were making. They were based in fact, which is a really interesting perspective when you're telling stories such as this.
Yeah, I think so. As you discussed, is it still? It's at least one of the poorest counties in North Carolina, if it's not the poorest.
I think one of, I think it really depends on the year or that 5-year period, but it's traditionally, one of the poorer counties in the country.
Yeah, I mean, Eastern North Carolina is traditionally the poorer part of the state, and so it's certainly in its southeast. Majority Native American, which is an interesting element to this. The Lumbee Indians I know about. I guess a third of the population is white and a quarter is African American, and it's had a long, well, like a lot of counties in the American South, but it would have had it's had a troubled history, specifically, even more so than others. And then this whole thing about the police force. Now, I don't try to personalize these sort of interviews, but I can now speak personally on this. I used to drive through Robeson County on a regular basis, and I wasn't especially a very religious man at the time, but I would pray that every time I drive through there that I would not get stopped, because we all knew. I mean, it was even before Operation Tarnish Shield or whatever it's called.
Tarnish Badge, yeah.
Tarnish Badge. I mean, you did not want to get stopped in Robeson County. So I would be on I-95. Whatever speed limit I was doing, legally or not, officially legally. But you hit as soon as you hit the county line, I would go under the speed limit.
Yeah.
And people knew that, it was sort of, I think you talk about very well. I mean, it so happens to be almost exactly halfway between sort of South Florida and New York on Cocaine Alley, which is also really I-95. So the crack, the crack cocaine epidemic really hit Robeson County hard. And so I don't think it's any, there's no, as you say, it's a very interesting place to be to do a true crime doc, isn't it? To already not only have these suspicions, but it's pretty much all been confirmed.
Much of it has.
Yeah,
much of it has. And it is I believe, one could do a whole documentary series just on the history of Robeson County. And, our approach to this and really looking at all the facts. And once we looked at all the archival material and the interviews, we knew that the history of Robeson County, telling the history of Robeson County was going to be such an important part of the story, which is also why we really fought creatively to put that in the earlier parts of the story, because as you said, Robeson County. I grew up in North Carolina. Yeah. I know Robeson County, and I know that it's not a place that you would want to ever pull your car over to the side of the road, or that you would want to get pulled over by law enforcement because of that history. But we know that audiences don't have that view and that insight into the county. So we wanted to place it very early in the series because it does kind of inform your understanding of everything that has transpired up until that point and will transpire from that point on. And, it is an immensely fractured place. It's one of the, most violent places that especially at that period of time.
That's right.
That you can think of, the highest murder rate in the state. And, one of the former editor of the Robesonian newspaper, Donnie Douglas, says it was just a bit like the Wild West, and I think that that's a fair, comparison for how things were at that period of time. The drug business had taken control. Certain deputies, not everyone by any means, but certain members of law enforcement were involved in that trade. And certain people that come into the play in this story surrounding this case were involved in that trade. So what we've always wanted to do from the beginning is use the crime and the killing of James Jordan as kind of a gateway into a larger conversation about corruption in law enforcement and systemic racism in the criminal justice system, which is really kind of embodied by this crime taking place in this county. Had it taken place in a different county in North Carolina, had it taken place in Raleigh, where I grew up, or Charlotte, where the Jordan family lived, it might have been a very different situation. We don't know. We can't hypothesize about that. But specifically taking place in Robeson County led to information being in question because of how certain facts were treated and how certain, elements were given, of evidence were given from law enforcement to the prosecution. I think the prosecution tried the evidence that they were given. I think the question is the root of that evidence.
Yeah. As you said, it also further leads to this other sort of conspiracy that's been out there about the mystery around James Jordan's death and, all kinds of crazy stuff that people had ideas about maybe being behind this. But as you said previously, anytime you start having these things that just don't add up, then people's minds will run wild with them.
And that's exactly what happened, right? And we saw that, and we used some articles and some, information that was released shortly around the time. It happened almost immediately. Almost immediately, people were like, something must be happening here. And it's my belief, having spent a lot of time with this story and with this case, that that's because of these things that didn't add up. And the story of why those things didn't add up is the part of this that has never been told. Yeah. And so that's part of what really motivated us, was bringing those elements to light so people could have a full understanding of what happened.
Okay. And I think this obviously then takes us to the other one of the main subjects of this film is obviously Daniel Green. Now, I'm sure you'll economize a bit in terms of what you share, because we want, you'll want people to see the film and for the film to speak, the series to speak for itself. But is it fair enough to just say that things are not as they have necessarily been reported, and he himself is a victim of Robeson County?
What I would say is, the way we present this series, we wanted to build it almost like a trial itself.
Yeah.
And we were very fortunate, because of, some amazing work that had been done, by the news team at WRAL starting in the 90s. They're really the kind of authority on tracking this case, really, for long periods of time. We had the ability to have materials to work with that no one has ever had access to before. Yeah. And I think if you look at the approach to that, it's really about giving a voice to Daniel, because Daniel has not had a voice in this conversation. One, this case was not reported on nationally nearly as much as it was in the state of North Carolina. And here's a person who's maintained his innocence for almost, 30 years. And, that is in many cases, but especially ones that are as high profile as this, you would think that would be a bigger national news story with a lot of the social change. And as we reevaluate so many things that were handled improperly in the past, for a variety of reasons, that story has not gotten to a place of large national attention. What I always kind of say when asked this question is, I'm not a judge and I'm not a jury and I'm not an attorney, because it's not our job as documentarians, I believe, to kind of make that determination at the law. It's our job to be the vehicle to present all the facts and allow the audience and the viewer to come to their own beliefs as to what happened. I think where I end up personally, and I am comfortable in saying this, is I believe there's enough question of fact that a new hearing is something that should be granted, because there is enough evidence and there are enough things in question as opposed to what was presented, or in some of the things that were not even allowed to be presented during the original trial that have come out since, and statements that have come out since from other individuals who were involved who didn't speak at the time of trial. I think that a new hearing is warranted.
I think you do that very well. You've even got the DA on who comes on. I thought that was quite impressive. He obviously believes he's got the right, and when you're talking about Daniel Green, he has his views, but he's very upfront about it as well. I thought that was extremely well done.
Thank you. And look, and it's a real testament to, also the team, the team of journalists that I worked with in creating this, Clay Johnson and Jay Jennings, Shelley Leslie, kind of leading that team from a producerial standpoint. And, I think working with one of the larger news networks in the state, there's a history of reporting facts that is very celebrated, in the state of North Carolina. And I think therefore people were very willing to speak about this, knowing that the story would be told with a degree of integrity. Johnson Britt, the district attorney, is absolutely convinced that he got the right guy in convicting Daniel. And that's his opinion. Mm-hmm. I believe that with the evidence that he was given, that if you were given the same degree of evidence and you're a prosecutor, that may be your belief as well. A lot of people try to look at this case and say, well, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? And I think it's not as simple as that, right? We live in a very gray areas in our society. And this is a case that fully exists in those gray areas. I think Johnson Britt was elected to be the district attorney, and he was doing his job as a prosecutor in that case based on evidence that was provided to him. I think the question is the evidence. And I think the question is, when you look at these things that, with a, almost 30-year difference in view of how society was then, I think you look at the jury, it was a very compromised verdict. People convicted, the jury convicted Daniel, but they didn't necessarily believe the testimony that convicted him. And, so I think there's always been question about this case. And that's what we really strive to do, is present all of those questions in a concise manner, and then allow the audience to go on that journey and have a real understanding of both sides of the argument. Like I said, we structured the series like a trial, there's almost two prologues. There's the investigation and the discovery of the murder. There's the history of Robeson County. And then once we're in the final 3 episodes, we're really kind of entering a trial. The prosecution goes first, the defense comes second. And that's by design, because there's going to be people who come out on both sides of this. Some people are going to say, oh yes, those 2 teenagers are guilty, they did it. And then some people are going to say, no, there's something we need to look into more here. And that's what life is, right? Yeah. So as a documentarian, that was our goal, to present all sides of it. So having Johnson Britt's voice in that conversation, as well as Daniel's post-conviction attorney, Chris Muma, who's fighting for his innocence, you need both sides of that argument if you're going to tell the full story.
Yeah. And I think, in fairness to Johnson Britt, he even acknowledges mistakes he made, in trying that, and he's very upfront about that. And I think one last thing I'm going to ask about, one thing that comes out of this, I think, at least for me, because I've seen a few of these true crime docs of kind of a similar line of, do you have an innocent man? Has he been convicted wrongly, or certainly of a particular the crime in question? It's this, if anything, and I don't know if you want to speak to this, but I think police just have to get better training on how you really should interrogate potential the perpetrators, because it's this. I've seen it elsewhere where it's always this kind of, they latch on to maybe even rightly, whatever was going on, maybe they do legitimately think these 2 are the ones, but then the way they elicit the confessions and everything is just it's so suspect sometimes.
I agree with you. I think that I think many of those aspects are suspect. And I would imagine, again, I'm not an expert in police testimony, but I'm only, have an understanding of what transpired in this case because of extensive research and reading the logs and going through all the tapes. I don't know if the practices have improved in any way, shape, or form since this period of time. I don't know if it was specific to tactics that were used in this area of the country that, maybe would not be acceptable today. But there are a lot of issues with the interrogation. It's something that we revisit a couple different times throughout the course of the series and reveal more pieces of information from that interrogation that resulted in kind of this public story. I think it's also something to be said that, these 2 individuals, these 2 teenagers were known to law enforcement, specifically Larry. He had a history of, you mentioned earlier, that crack cocaine and cocaine coming up I-95, really took root in Robeson County. It's an area where, people would swap vehicles, and, that it was known on the route for drug smuggling. And Larry was involved in that. Yeah. And that's not a matter of assumption. That's a matter of fact. He was involved in the drug trade, and law enforcement was involved in the drug trade. We've come to learn, over the years. So while we don't know what their interaction was with one another, it was known, and Daniel mentions this at one point, and it really struck me, is that Larry would get pulled over by the police and then let go. One of the things that I noticed, which really I found shocking, is when the police when law enforcement, when the sheriff's department is walking Daniel and Larry in and out of buildings, Daniel's in handcuffs, Larry is not. And I think most shocking, Larry was allowed to go home while he was still in the sheriff's department, jail, awaiting to be transferred. He was allowed to go home and have dinner with his family on Sunday nights. I had never heard of anyone who had been charged with first-degree murder that was allowed to leave jail to go have dinner with their family on Sunday nights. So there's a lot of questions here, and there was a lot of. It started in that interrogation where it was decided who was going to get treated one way and who was going to get treated a different way. And so I do believe that, if those types of practices are still existing, that's definitely something we need to look at as a society. And that starts with the training, as you said. I think, I think that's a big, for us, that's really the largest part of this, right? Like I said, the crime is a gateway to this larger story of flaws in our criminal justice system and flaws in our law enforcement. And the fact that we're still seeing these, we were very heavily, deep in the edit of the series when everything came to light last summer in the murder of George Floyd. And it was just such a sobering reminder of how little progress we've made, despite the fact that we think we've made so much progress as a society and as a culture. It just shows how far we still have to go. And working and telling this story, especially, like I said, as we were editing after, everything came to the forefront of the public conversation last summer, it just was, like I said, it was a very sad reminder that we need to relook at everything.
Yeah. I think that's what strikes, almost all of us, is that here we go again, it seems like. And as you say, in that context, I want to ask you, how did this, you've mentioned WRAL a few times, saw appearances by people I even remember from my days there. How did this film come about? Was this something, because I hadn't put two and two together, but because early on, the journalists say something like, well, this is why we wanted to bring this story to light. And then it's slowly, I realized, no, wait a minute. And then put two and two together, Capital Broadcasting, that this is something that, did they approach you? How did this come about?
So I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. I moved to North Carolina late 80s. We started moving in the late 80s, but officially was living there full time in 1990. Okay. So I lived there at this period of time where, as you said, this was a massive story. And I was there up until I went to college. Back in New York, which is where I was originally from. And Jimmy Goodman, the Goodman family has, owned Capital Broadcasting since its inception in the 1940s, the Goodman family. And Jimmy Goodman, who's one of our executive producers on the series, he was the real impetus for the idea of this series. He had reached out to me. We went to high school together. We've been friends, since the 90s. And his brother Michael. His brother Michael and Jimmy was older than me, so he was like the cooler guy. Michael was a year younger than me, so Michael and I were actually better friends growing up. But Jimmy had seen, obviously, a lot of the documentary work that I've done as a producer over the years, and said, hey, we have this massive archive. And I don't think anyone even knew that this existed. Most local news networks didn't keep their tapes. They didn't keep their archives from the previous decades, because of the volume of storage space and the maintaining it in climate controlled environments. And they did. WRL did. And so when they got to digitizing the 90s, it was 2018, the 25th anniversary of the crime was coming up. And he said, I have my news team working on this. And as I mentioned, some amazing, journalists working out of that station, Clay Johnson, who I co-direct episodes 1 and 2 with, Jay Jennings, who was a co-editor, and Cliff Baumgardner, who was a close cinematographer and worked as an archivist on the series as well. Just amazing Emmy award-winning news team out of WRAL. And so they had kind of started gathering this as something that potentially was going to air on the network at first. And then Jimmy called me on their network. And then Jimmy called me and was like, look, as we're kind of putting the pieces together on this thing, I just think it's so much bigger. And he started telling me about this archive. He started telling me about some of the interviews that they had already secured, and they had banked in their, in their archives. And I was like, this is definitely bigger. So that's when I got involved and really, we started working together as a team to create this series. And it's been an amazing journey. I mean, it's been, these series, we were working, and then COVID obviously happened, which slowed everything down, and limited what you could do from a production standpoint and a travel standpoint. We actually did the majority of the edit for the series in COVID. But yeah, that's how it came to be. It was really a high school friend called me up and said, hey, I have this. We're working on this. We had this idea to do something with this. What do you think? And I was like, yes, I absolutely want to be a part of it. So then that very organically grew into, co-directing and then directing the final 3 episodes myself.
Okay. I mean, I think as you mentioned, the use of archives, I mean, you weren't living down there yet, but I was there during the standoff at the Robesonian, and I thought that was, I brought back a lot of memories because I remember when that happened. But I think, so you have this, so I was going to ask you about this. So you did, as you said, most of the post-production under COVID, but I guess you got a little bit lucky because it seemed to me a lot of the filming, you did get a lot of filming done.
Yeah, a lot of the filming was done prior, yes. And we were actually, we were filming, pretty much up until we had shut down, we were, I think one of the last interviews with Amanda Lamb was filmed in late February or first week of March. I mean, it was the following week, that we ended up having to shut everything down and move to a virtual work environment. But, and look, there were more interviews that, had COVID not happened that I would have loved to have gotten. But we pivoted and we made it work. We did a lot of audio interviews from that point on. So we could mix that with some of the footage that we had, if we had follow-up questions. A lot of times, when we're making documentaries, you realize, oh, we need to address this item or that item. That's, have someone explain more. So, sometimes there'll be second interview shoots, in different environments, but in this case, we could do those via audio and ask additional questions. So that was great. And, we were very fortunate, to have the degree of access that we have, to have the degree of footage. But it was funny. I mean, a lot of this stuff, like, we didn't get a chance to go do an additional B-roll shoot, which is something that had always been planned. So I would call Cliff and I would be like, okay, like, you just have to go out, like, one man and a camera, and like, here's the shot list. And he'd go out and get some of these, drone shots and get some of these exteriors. And he'd FaceTime me from his car, from wherever, and say, hey, look at the camera angle. And I say, okay, great. Yeah, that's great. The elementary school, exterior. And so we were doing it all virtually, and we figured out how to make it work. And we're extremely proud of not just extremely proud of the series itself, but it was a pretty Herculean task to kind of see it through to the end. So we're very proud of being able to make it this way.
And as you've already mentioned, you've got this long career for someone who's so young by my standards of producing. But why did you decide to direct? I mean,
well, I'd always wanted to direct for a long period of time. I've produced many documentaries. The first documentary I ever produced, I'm very fortunate. I kind of took a very sideways path into the entertainment business. I dropped out of college when I was 19, which I don't advise anyone to do because it's not an easy road. But I was going to NYU, and I dropped out of college because I'd read that Paul Thomas Anderson dropped out of college, and I was like, hey, if you can do it, and if you can drop out of NYU, I can drop out of NYU. And I moved to Los Angeles in 1999. Kind of packed up my car, and my uncle lived out here. So he was like, you can crash on my couch while you figure out what your next steps are going to be. And I just started working on sets, and originally came out to LA thinking that I would be a writer and a director. And as I was working on sets as a PA and I worked for a distribution company for a number of years, and realized that producing was something that I loved and loved the idea of doing. So I just started making movies, and I produced my first movie when I was 23. So that was where my career came from. But, I always still wanted to direct. I always still wanted to write, and I would direct a lot of the short form documentary content we would produce. We did my company would do a bunch of series, for Marvel. We did a series with Ta-Nehisi Coates about his run on the Black Panther, called A Nation Under Our Feet, and I directed that. And so I was directing, but I wasn't kind of taking credit for directing. And then when Jimmy reached out to me about this story, and I really started delving into outlining it and restructuring it and looking at what footage existed, what we needed to add, what we needed to get, and I just felt so connected to it, having come from that place and lived there at that time, and honestly witnessed so many of the themes and the things we're going to be talking about in this series with my own eyes at a young age, which really informed who I wanted to be and the types of films I wanted to make and stories I wanted to get out in the world. I was really passionate about directing it at that point. So.
And did you enjoy it?
I did. I absolutely loved it. I love producing, and I'm still going to continue producing as well. And it's not like, I'm just taking that hat off permanently and putting the director hat on solely, but I absolutely loved it. And it's something that I'm definitely going to continue doing in moving forward in conjunction with my producing. And, with documentaries, which is something I love. I produced my first documentary. We started filming it the filmmaker had filmed some footage prior, but, which is very important footage. It's a film called More Than a Game about LeBron James.
Right.
And the director on that, Chris Bellman, had actually followed them their senior year. He started that as a school project. Then he was living in Los Angeles and said, I have all this footage. And I was like, yeah, that's very important footage. So that was the first documentary I ever produced, and it premiered Toronto 2008 and then came out in 2009. But I'd always loved documentary. I always knew I wanted to produce documentary. That was my first, and it became part of my practice and as a producer to always have documentaries, at least one or two documentaries in production and post each year. And I'm extremely proud of the work that I've done. And, we just had a film that we produced called The Truffle Hunters, just came out a couple of weeks ago. And then last year we had The Fight, which was about the ACLU, and a film called Disclosure on Netflix, which is all about transgender representation in media. What I love about documentaries is it allows you to enter into all these worlds. And, I think if you enter into those worlds and you understand the gravity of, these are real people's lives. So there's a real responsibility to telling the stories truthfully. I hope that everyone takes the approach to documentary the same way. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But, that's always my intention. And, being in the director's chair, I get to kind of, be on both sides of that equation.
Yeah. I think you just raised it because I was going to ask you about this because on Truffle Hunters and The Fight, and I've had several people recommend Truffle Hunters to me. So I'm keen to see that. But you have an executive producer credit. So how is that different for you? Is it different for you as producing versus executive producer? And what stage do you get involved in with those projects?
It really depends on the project, right? So both of those projects, I would say I was, myself and my company and Michael Sherman, my business partner, we were involved relatively early, but we weren't, we're based in LA. The Fight was shooting in New York. We knew that we weren't going to be day in, day out producers, and I do believe that people who put in the work deserve that credit. I think that credit sometimes kind of gets handed out for a variety of reasons. That is not, the person, anyone who ever asked me is like, what does a producer do? And I always kind of say like, well, if a film wins the Academy Award for Best Picture, the producer is the one taking home the statue, because they're really involved in every aspect of the creation of that film, many times, and in many cases before even a director is hired, a producer's developing material. And so I really believe that credit should be preserved for the people that are going to be on set every day, putting in that work. And on all three of those films, we knew that we were not going to be, the ones on set every day. We're going to be involved in more of a, advisory capacity and more, we weren't able to travel to Italy to shoot Truffle Hunters, and Michael and Gregory are the only two producers on that film. They're also the directors and the writers of that film. And they deserve those credits because they were the ones in there every day. We were talking to them consistently. We were going through all the cuts, going through all the footage, going through, doing the work from a creative and from a business perspective, helping kind of structure the film financially, et cetera. But, and working with them, throughout the process. I always say, regardless of what my credit is, you're going to get all of me. Everything I have to offer. It doesn't, but I do believe that, if I'm not in the trenches day in, day out on a shoot, then someone else should get that producer credit. And I knew on that film specifically, we were filming some other documentaries, which will be coming out later this year, that we physically couldn't be present when those, specifically to the fight and Truffle Hunters were filming.
Okay. And we should give a little shout out to your firm. It's Bow and Arrow Entertainment, right? So I don't think we've done a shout out yet for them. Any preferences? Or is it just each role's a little different? You like, producing versus directing?
I like, and this has always been our philosophy at Bow and Arrow, and it's built off of my philosophy and Sherman's philosophy, or personally, that we like supporting different voices. We like getting voices out into the world that need to be heard. And, we always say that if you look at the films that we've made, it's a really wide group. You know what I mean? A lot of times you'll see production companies and they'll say, oh, they're really good at doing comedies and they focus on comedy. Or this company's really good at documentaries and they just do documentaries. Or this company's really good at, horror movies and they just do horror movies. Our interests are varied. We love all different types of film. So we work with all different types of filmmakers and want to, help bring those films to life. And so we kind of always equate it to, if like we were an art gallery and we were curating one gigantic group show, all the paintings on the walls are very different, but the through lines of how those decisions were made to participate in those films are similar. And you see that kind of connectivity between them. I love all roles. I love making films. That's what I wanted to do this my entire life. So regardless of what my credit is, or regardless of if I'm, I can only be present in so many places at one time, which I'm aware of. But if I can participate in more films in other capacities and help those filmmakers in other ways, then that's what I've always done my whole career. And so I love doing all aspects of it.
I think that's great. I mean, it's even more specialized than you've made it out to be. I mean, I know production companies that maybe they only do music docs, or maybe they only do doc series, or or true crime, or whatever. It starts, and for companies get pigeonholed that way too.
Yeah, I mean, I think early in my career, I was always like, I'm never going to get pigeonholed. I think maybe part of it kind of came from that place. And I think kind of as I actually started making films and started working in different environments with different types of filmmakers and different stories, I realized that I just loved every aspect of it. Some of my favorite films are documentaries. Some of my favorite films are, Silence of the Lambs is technically a horror film. It's one of my favorite movies. I mean, it's got some issues that didn't stick with time, but from a filmmaking standpoint, Jonathan Demme did things. Yeah. I mean, I think he created the modern insert in a way that is like, it changed cinema, and, so there's all types of different films. And I think, as human beings, we have different interests, right? So why limit yourself to just one thing, which is an exciting place to approach our world from in entertainment.
Yeah. And you've done well from it, but do you ever find that is an issue that when you go into discussions with different studios or whoever, that I guess that's maybe human nature. We do want to tend to pigeonhole people. So
I mean, I think that's natural, right? I think a lot of times, and it happens, I think most with filmmakers, if someone kind of gets in the genre space, they think they can only do genre, you know what I mean? If someone gets in the comedy space, they only look to them for doing comedy. One of the great kind of, joys of my life and my career has been working with the community at Sundance and the Sundance Institute and participating in the Sundance Film Festival. And I'm very fortunate to have had a lot of films play at that festival. And films of all different types, and I think that's one of the things that I think the film festivals, give us a great ability to do is to not just discover new voices and new filmmakers and new actors and artists across the board, but it also allows a diversification. They're curating these selections, and they're coming at it from looking at how do we present different types of things than you're going to see directly via the traditional studio system. And so that's, I've always enjoyed too, like when a filmmaker, like let's say there is a filmmaker who's known for doing X, and then they go and make their indie film, and that's why, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like that's, I think that the fact that space exists in our community is wonderful. And that's why I also really believe strongly that we have to protect it. And we have to make sure that, a lot of people have always said for so long, well, independent film and documentary it's not good business. And it's like, well, no, it's just sometimes people don't know how to approach it with a business mindset. So that was also a big part of Bow and Arrow was, a lot of times, in my career, I always felt like, oh, I'd produce this job, I'd produce this job, and then I'd get to every 2 or 3 years produce something I really loved. And I was like, so Sherman and I, when we started the company, we were like, well, what if we built a business around producing the films that we love? And what if we tried to, and that means sometimes smaller budgets. That means paying ourselves a lot less. That means, not doing things traditionally. But ultimately, I think we're very proud of what we've created over the past 7 years and the films we've brought out into the world.
Yeah, and I think you're going to be far happier, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it really boils down to is, I love filmmaking because I love filmmaking, and it's independent filmmaking is not an easy job. It's entertainment in general is not an easy job. I remember reading a statistic that it was like a 3% success rate, and success was defined by you can just do that job and not have a second job to support yourself and just pay your bills. I think in the independent world, you would minimize that number substantially from 3% even. Yeah. But it's what I love doing. And I feel fortunate every day and lucky every day that I get to do it. And the fact that that's now circled back for me in my life and my career, back to directing and back to kind of creating in this way, it's something I feel I'm very appreciative of. And I think about that every day.
Okay. Well, I hate to say it, but I think we're coming to the end of our time together, Matthew. But before we go, I just wanted to ask, what is next for you and also for Bow and Arrow?
Yeah, I'm working on a couple projects that I cannot speak about yet.
Always the case.
That I cannot speak about yet, but a couple things that we're just getting shooting going on right now that I'm really excited about. I'll come back and I'll shoot you an email or something and tell you all the details. But
please do.
And from Bow and Arrow standpoint, we have a couple documentaries that we're working on with some really exciting filmmakers as well. So I'm excited for the world to find out about those a couple months from now.
Okay. Well, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure having you on. To remind our listeners, we've been having a lovely chat here with Matthew Perniciaro, director and producer of Moment of Truth. It will be available on IMDb TV from April 2nd.
Thank you for having me.
Also want to give a shout out to our engineer, Freddie Besbrode, and the rest of the team at This Is Distorted Studios in Leeds, England. A big thanks to Nevena Paunovic, our podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who ensures we continue getting such great guests like Matthew onto the show. Finally, a big thanks to our listeners, and as always, we'd love to hear from you, so please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. And please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.